Thank you, Joachim, and it's a pleasure to come before the NCCC and update you on the work of the authority, particularly in the inner north, which a large part of our precinct is located. As you said in your introduction, we've put together a short presentation, and it is, I promise, short in order to give you an opportunity to ask questions of me and Doug. The presentation will give you an update on some of our current projects across the entire City Renewal Precinct, and then towards the end I'll focus in on Dixon and in particular Section 72 and what we envisage as the way forward for the expansion of, or inclusion I should say, of that section into our precinct.
Just before
Doug,
you
sure.
go on, Malcolm,
yes.
Will you be able to share that presentation with us?
After tonight,
as
you
a
mean?
PDF or whatever?
Yes, of course.
Okay, great.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Yes, be very pleased to.
Thanks.
So, Doug, if you're happy to drive the slides and I can talk to those.
For sure.
Thanks, Doug. I should begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal as the traditional custodians and recognise any other people or families with connections to the lands of the ACT and the region. We acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and this region. And I acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be joining us tonight. Many of you, some of you may be aware of our origins as an authority. We are a statutory authority of the ACT government. To the right, you can see a map showing the extent of the declared City Renewal Precinct, now updated to include Section 72, and to the right are the contributory places, as we like to refer to them, within our precinct. Government has asked us, and we have developed and formulated at least a 30-year plus urban renewal program for the precinct, and we are now in our approaching our nearly 7th year as we were first created in 2017 of that work. We have put to government recently the second tranche, as we call it, of our renewal program, and are seeking funding for that next forward program of renewal works. The focus is on the city centre, Braddon and Dixon, but in between we've got a number of other places that are of direct interest to us, such as the Macarthur Urban Node, Hague Park, and then within Civic, the different contributory districts. In a summary, we're working to deliver really excellent, high-quality place experiences, and we're doing that through a really clear approach to design and a place strategy, and influencing the quality and the type of development that's occurring within our precinct. Thanks, Doug. The slides that follow are really just some highlights of our program, and one of the important things we need to demonstrate to government and community is that our work and our efforts are actually resulting in positive outcomes, and that's why we measure and quantify and constantly refer to data that we can collect through a particular tool that we have on the impact we're having, in this case on visitation to the precinct. And what we can show through just one of those projects, which was the greening of City Walk, or a part of it, that we achieved a 340% increase in evening visitation as a direct result of those public space improvements. We can also point to the fact that, again, using that tool that I talked about, the Place Success Dashboard, we call it, we've achieved at least a 42% increase in visitors to the city centre in December evenings compared to 2021, for example, and at least 50% more visitors in 2023 than there were in 22. We're certainly not resting on our laurels, and certainly our ambition is to improve those figures even further because that instills confidence in government that our renewal program is working and having the impact it should. In relation to economic impact, Again, coming back to that same project, City Walk, we can show within the first 2 years of completing that upgrade that there has been a return on the capital investment of at least 1.2. So we measure that through a variety of indicators, but certainly a positive economic impact as a direct result of investing and in the quality of the public environment in the precinct is important to our work. And we can also show that through our activation programs, through events, through the other things we do in relation to from very small to major events such as participation and support for the Multicultural Festival, that we're also achieving a positive ROI in a good range. And again, we want to improve upon that over time. Our projects are diverse and are spread across the entire precinct. A number of them are focused in the city centre, as we call it, and they relate very much to improving what we see are very tired public spaces that have lacked investment in terms of that infrastructure, and much of that infrastructure is reaching a point now where not only above ground but below ground we need to work closely with TCCS to present joint business cases to get government to fund those improvements. That's why it's important, as I said a moment ago, that we can show a positive social and economic impact through that investment. We're doing works in Braddon and a number of other places. One of the important things is that we can provide new connections for people to the places within our precinct, and that very much is driven by making those spaces as attractive as they can be, because if we do that, then people will come and return. They'll tell other people about the positive experiences that they've had in those places, and that applies across the entire precinct, not just the city centre. City greening, doing our bit to contribute to reducing heat island effects and the other effects of climate change within our precinct are important, and we take cues from the broader sustainability strategies and climate strategies of the ACT government to contribute to the actions that are set out in those strategies. And a lot of our work, particularly around greening, increasing tree canopy cover, those sorts of initiatives, reducing those heat island effects, as I said, are important. We have on the books at the moment plans to, and indeed have engaged consultants to work with us on improvements to a project that we're calling the Civic Spine, which will improve the Alinga and Kooyong Street locations. These are important connections between the different places in our precinct. In the case of Alinga Street, if you followed all the way from ANU around to the new UNSW campus in Reed, again, we think that's a very important priority, particularly for walkability and increasing active travel within the city centre. The Sydney and Melbourne buildings have been a project that was one of the first initiatives that we identified and which government agreed needed to be addressed. Many have tried before us, but our success in relation to recent upgrades, for example, to Verity and Odgers Lane, has been a direct result of working with the more than 80 different owners and businesses in those two buildings to get them to acknowledge that these improvements were important. It was also going to address problems that they as lessees were experiencing with the buildings in relation to things like stormwater drainage. So again, an example of where we worked with TCCS to combine a major stormwater upgrade in both those lanes and our funding coming over and supporting landscape upgrades to ultimately ensure that these spaces can be well-used public spaces, not simply service courts, which were full of rubbish, dangerous. They have now been converted into attractive public spaces, which the traders are now trading into. So these small spaces, as well as the larger spaces, are important to us, and we're about to embark on the next phase of our program of restoration works, which is to, through a funding grant program provided by the ACT government, we will give these building owners access to those funds to paint the external facades of their buildings. And that program is about to kick off. Acton Waterfront, a project that has been conceived, well, really conceived if you want to go back to the Griffins in 1915 in the original plan, then picked up again in 2002 through the Griffin Legacy, and an initiative, an exciting initiative, which really does seek to utilise the very best asset we have in central Canberra, which is the lake, and do as the Griffins intended, which was to create a new urban waterfront on what was formerly a surface car park. There has been progressive stages of plan development and design, starting with Henry Rollin Park, the development of the boardwalk and the new lake wall, resuming 2.8 hectares approximately of lake bed mud and converting that now into a 3-hectare park. We have recently led a contract for the early works for the park, which includes the introduction of topsoil, major earthworks, stormwater drainage, and all of that is preparatory to what will follow next year in relation to the construction of the actual park at a cost of nearly $35 million. Also underway is what we call the estate development planning, which is the development behind the park and backing on to Parks Way. That estate development planning is guided by the National Capital Plan, so we have to demonstrate that our planning and ultimate development plans for that comply with those planning controls, and we're confident that that will be the case. And again, our consultants are working on that estate development plan, and that will be made public and be consulted on later this year. Some of you would be aware that we're currently, in fact, still conducting an ideas competition for City Hill, a part of central Canberra, which again was very important to the Griffin plan, was conceived in their plan as being the location for a new city hall, but which, fast forward to today, the National Capital Plan says should remain fundamentally as a public park. We agree with that. The problem, however, is that it's almost inaccessible. It's not particularly well used. And so this ideas exhibition, which had the support of the Chief Minister, was to go to the entire Canberra community and ask for their best ideas as to what they would like to see happen to transform this from literally being Canberra's largest roundabout to a significant central park that was well used, popular, and was marked by not only formal civic occasions, but also informal use for picnicking, just as any other park should be. We've received some very interesting ideas. We've had a great response from the community to that invitation, and we will be making those ideas public through a combination of a physical exhibition at the Civic Library, but also putting them on our website for people to look at. Government has asked us to prepare a report on what we heard and saw through this process, and then it will be up to government to decide what next steps they would like to take to convert some of those ideas into firm proposals. Some of the other things that we're planning for financial year 24 plus are continued expansion of our involvement in Enlighten, Floriade and the National Multicultural Festival into the city centre. Previously, those festivals had no presence in the city centre whatsoever, and we've worked very hard over the last 4 to 5 years to work with Major Events Canberra to get a component of those major festivals, particularly Enlighten and Floriade, with a much stronger presence in the city centre to ensure that people have the ability to come into the city centre and experience those festivals in the city centre where we think naturally they should be, and worked with the organisers of the National Multicultural Festival to turn that into an even more successful event for the city centre. And this year's Multicultural Festival was an outstanding success, and we want to build on that and determined to ensure that it remains one of the major events that contribute to city activation. Our program of placemaking grants funded through the City Centre Improvement Levy continue on. These grants have proven to be, again, really effective ways of asking the community to give us their best ideas that contribute to our placemaking objectives. Those have been taken up with great effect, and we are generating a lot of interest from the broader community in applications for those grants. And we have the challenge of actually picking the best ideas out of the applications that we receive. But certainly those grants will continue, and they'll continue to be funded by the levy, which was one of the reasons why it was established. The Christmas campaign is something we do regularly, of course, and we're committed to continuously improving that. And there'll be some exciting announcements about this year's Christmas campaign later in the year. We also support our own festivals and fund our own festivals, winter being a great example, that again attracts high visitation, and we monitor those attendances on a regular basis. We're also seeking to improve the appeal of City West, which is the area between ANU and City Hill, an area which we felt was somewhat neglected, but which has great potential because of its high student population and the mix of uses, particularly cultural uses such as the ANU School of Art, the Street Theatre, the Drill Hall, to name some. And so we are working on a plan to ensure that City West, my working title is the West End of Canberra. And I think that connection with other West Ends is deliberate, because I think it could be a very vibrant, very attractive, certainly in terms of the night economy, could be a very important contributory place. The other thing I should mention is that we, again, through the levy funding, provide place-based cleaning and maintenance over and above what TCCS do as the asset maintenance, with the asset maintenance responsibilities that they have. We use that levy funding to do extra things such as floral displays, high pressure cleaning. As you can see, before and after in that particular image, we do a number of other things around the installation and maintenance of additional street furniture. It's working extremely well, and we've had very favourable feedback from levy payers about the positive impact that this extra maintenance is providing. And it's something that we, I quickly should add, that we do across the precinct in Braddon and Dickson as well. Moving to Dickson, some of you may be aware, if you've participated in our engagement exercises, now have support from the government to turn our attention, perhaps long overdue, but nevertheless, Dickson's time has come in relation to funding a major makeover of, firstly, Dickson shops as public spaces. We appreciate it's a really important centre, one which is undergoing significant urban change. But when we look at the existing public spaces of Dickson shops, they're not only tired, the infrastructure needs replacement, but we also recognise that economically this is a centre which needs to have around it attractive public spaces, just as the city centre does, to attract private investment, support the growing population, but also to address the attractiveness of, the centre, which is well overdue in our view. The other second renewal initiative is that we are also now looking at and thinking about the Dickson streetscapes which surround the Dickson shops. So I'm talking specifically about Chalice Street and the other streets around Dickson, Anthill Street, Dickson Place, these are all, again, streets that have perhaps not had the level of investment that they perhaps deserve, particularly in the light of the amount of redevelopment that's been happening in Dixon. We want to make sure that we have in place plans and designs which developers who are developing sites in Dixon Group Centre can also pay for as part of their obligation for external works. And that can be supplemented, we hope, with a business case to government to also get capital works funding to actually implement those improvements progressively across Dixon. So that design work is underway now. Moving specifically, Jürgen asked for maybe some commentary around Section 72. It is, I should say, very early days because the decision to extend the precinct, which was made by the Chief Minister in accordance with our Act, has only just recently been officially notified in the official ACT legislation register. We anticipated that that would go through, and we therefore submitted as part of our business case for that tranche 2 funding I referred to, applied for funding, operational OPEX funding at this stage, to be able to start doing what I would describe as the place planning work. We certainly know that there is a long history and engagement, particularly with your group and other groups in Dixon about this particular part of Dixon. It needs an integrated, coordinated redevelopment approach to it. And certainly I would say that the transfer of the responsibility for the future development of this part of Dixon is now in good hands with an authority such as ours, which perhaps other directorates maybe could not have provided. We will certainly look very carefully at the history of engagement, what was heard during those engagement processes, particularly around particular sites, the history of other developments such as the Common Ground, which we know was had a difficult passage. But at this stage, it's about us bringing ourselves up to speed with not only that history, but certainly when we receive confirmation from government that we have received funding through the new budget, that we will be able to commence our short and long-term place planning. All of our work starts with, again, engagement, listening to what all stakeholders, not only existing lessees in this area, but also the broader community, to what their aspirations and ambitions are for this part of the group centre. One of the important things that we already recognise must be addressed in that place planning is that this section 72, needs to be far better connected into the group centre and to the surrounding area. So the timing is good. As I said, we're looking already at Dixon shops and about the place planning and the place design work. That will dovetail very nicely with that further work that we're now going to be able to do in Section 72, which addresses connections to the shops, to the light rail, to the bus terminus, and to other assets, particularly the Sullivans Creek corridor and other parklands around it. So full of opportunity, but certainly, as I said, really keen to work with the full range of stakeholders, Jürgen. Very happy to open it up for any questions you might have.
Thanks heaps, Malcolm. Are there any questions?
Yes.
Leon.
Yeah, the ACT has 4 times the world's average per capita carbon footprint, and most of the local emissions are transport emissions. Now, if we can commute to our local shopping centre and do our job work there and do our shopping there and maybe have a primary school there, then we will spend a lot less time travelling and cause a lot less emissions than if we have to go into the city centre. Now, by promoting the city centre at the expense of local centres, you're actually increasing the amount of time we spend travelling and increasing our greenhouse emissions. Can you tell me what government agency has responsibility for developing local shopping centres and how well they're resourced?
Well, certainly we have a responsibility for the group centre called Dixon, but other group centres would fall within the purview of both the Planning Directorate and TCCS, particularly where those group centres have public assets such as public spaces, toilets, all of those things, parks. The differentiation between the city centre and Dixon, is possibly not helpful. Certainly one of our key renewal objectives is to promote active travel, and that includes walkability. It's why we, would take the view that we should be capitalising on the investment in those other forms of travel to favour those other modes over, for example, cars. That's why certainly in our commentary on development applications as a referral entity, it's something we seek to address in our commentary. But as I said a moment ago, this is a centre which should have high walkability and where the dependency and the necessity to come to the city centre is reduced. So I agree with you, but Dixon is a particular size. It needs to be a mixed-use centre. I don't necessarily see it as a workplace. There are office buildings and certainly further development to happen along Northbourne Avenue, adjacent to the group centre. So yes, the working population might increase over time, but I think the appeal of Dixon Leon is the fact that it is a mixed-use precinct, and it can be a place where the need to come to the city centre is reduced because of its facilities and the sorts of attractions it might offer.
Marcus.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for your presentation. It was very informative. My question relates to the interaction of your work and the new planning laws that have recently come into effect. My general understanding is most of the area within your boundaries would be privately owned, and therefore the main tool for regulating how that land is developed would be the Planning Act. And correct me if I'm wrong if there are additional controls and powers that you have. But I'm just wondering, there didn't seem to be much change on this corridor. I didn't look at it in detail, but there didn't seem to be a huge amount of change in the territory plan in this corridor. And I'm wondering if that's you'd like to see more change in terms of the planning controls, or how do you see that interacting your work with the planning law?
Yeah, look, thank you. That's a good question. Can I just remind you that a fair chunk of our designated precinct, in fact, is under the responsibility of the National Capital Authority, so not under the territory plan. So
right. Okay.
A fair chunk of the city centre, for example, is designated land, and we certainly liaise with the NCA very closely when we have views about development applications within the designated area. But certainly for the balance of our precinct, what I would also say is that the Northbourne Avenue corridor, the City Gateway corridor it's called, was the subject of a very specific piece of work that was done possibly a bit too late, because it probably could have been in place before light rail. But nevertheless, that is an example of where the NCA and the territory plan came together to prescribe a very high standard of development and design control. So the territory plan as updated, and the new territory plan acknowledges that work and embraces and incorporates the provisions of that work. Our role, to be clear, is that as a referral entity, we get to comment within 14 days, and we're given a very tight time frame, but within 14 days, we have to comment on all development applications that are referred to us by the DA team in EPSDD. We assess and comment on those proposals against our core renewal principles, but also have to be cognizant of the new territory plan controls, in particular, the urban design guidelines, which I think is one of the key innovations in the new territory plan, which gives not only guidance to applicants, but also gives entities such as us the ability to say, well, in our view, this proposal does not meet the guidelines and therefore is not supported. So I would argue that many of the improvements and the changes to the new territory plan are actually equipping us to be, better equipping us to comment critically as well as positively on developments and the quality of those developments within our precinct. So it is early days, but the indications are that having the ability to draw upon those guidelines is going to give us the ability to, where necessary, reject development proposals which aren't not only within the spirit but not within the intent of the planning controls.
Okay, thanks.
Ramon.
Thanks, Malcolm. I appreciated the presentation. Section 72 is the site of the Dixon Pool. I think a few of us might have noticed that the Dixon Pool's seen better days as of now. I think the state of the grass leaves a lot to be desired. Are fixes for the Dixon Pool within the scope of the urban renewal plan for Section 72, or is that a different agency's responsibility?
Look, they are under the responsibility of Sport and Rec, but certainly we would acknowledge, I think, through our work that it's such a critical piece of community infrastructure. Like much of Dixon, as I said earlier, it is showing its age. It is tired. But as we do with other parts of government, we certainly engage with them and try to understand how we can support business cases that they would put to government to secure capital funding to improve those assets. I mean, we are quite aggressive, I think, in that sense, that we don't assume that those agencies such as Sport and Rec within economic development, I think is the overarching directorate, we would want to, and certainly can certainly indicate tonight that one of the things we will be doing internally, we'll be having conversations with them about their plans for upgrading Dixon Pool. So certainly can commit to that, but can't make any firm promises that would result in funding. But certainly we believe that by joining with Sport and Rec, the prospects of winning new capital funding are going to be a lot stronger.
Good answer, thank you.
Simon.
Thank you, Malcolm, for your characterisation of Dixon as a little bit old and tired. I feel a bit like that some days. Two questions, one very brief one and one hopefully a bit more depth. First of all, the brief one, the graphic you showed near the start had a little part called Northbourne Corridor, which seemed to me as if it was the Canberra site. They had quite a detailed proposal up, I think in 2019-20.
Yeah.
Just wondering whether you know what the status of that is. It seems to have vanished into the ether. And
yes,
secondly,
sorry, go on.
Sorry, go on.
Oh, look, I'll answer your first question if I may. Certainly Canberra Wines site, if I could call it that, and Yawani, to the west of the Federal Highway, are within our precinct. You're correct. We were involved some years ago with, I think it was the Elvin Group, who were wanting to develop Canberra Winery site. Look, the short answer is that what they were proposing was, in our view, a gross overdevelopment of that site. And we said so to EPSDD. So, look, as to your question as to the status of that proposal, I don't really know. I think they were waiting on perhaps the outcome of the new territory plan and the Inner North District plan to understand how they would potentially revise their development ideas. And look, what I'd finally say is that certainly we are very much involved in the Iwani redevelopment scheme. And again, that's going backwards and forwards at the moment. But we've provided through that referral process some very direct and criticisms perhaps of the original scheme. So again, that forced some changes, but that's still a live development application.
Right. Thank you, Malcolm. And still on the theme of gross overdevelopment, I went to the tradies presentation 10 days ago or so.
Mm-hmm.
And the comment one of the architects made to me was that we're entitled to put 6 stories across this site. We're only covering about 50% of the site, so therefore we've gone up to 12 stories. Is that what we can expect from the future in our planning processes?
No, I would say, and again, I have seen the concept that was, I think, submitted to the NCDRP, the Design Review Panel. We have provided some feedback both to the applicant and his architects about that scheme. The history is that there is an obligation in that project to incorporate a major public space, a green space within the site, and that is defined in the lease, in the development lease. So to use an argument that they are providing a green space, but conveniently missing out the fact that that is an obligation they have anyway, and making that an excuse for taller development, really doesn't cut it with me. Personally, I was, and I'm using my words carefully, surprised at the height of the proposal, and particularly where proximate to single detached dwellings. We had RL 617 towers, which I thought was, again, perhaps far too ambitious. And I think they may well be providing these images and making these presentations to the community, but there will, I think, have to be a reality check in terms of what the actual planning controls would allow. And certainly at the moment, towers of RL 617 in particular locations, I don't think will pass the test.
Thank you, Malcolm.
Marianne. You are muted. Marianne, we can't hear you. You are muted. Marianne, we don't hear you. No. You need to sort it out. No.
Turn off your mute. Yes.
Yeah. Turn off your mute.
There we go.
Right, I'm sorry, the host had me muted. So sorry, I'm now very mute. Thank you for that, Malcolm. I really enjoyed the presentation. I have 2 concerns, and I noticed that the public areas you're looking at in Civic and also in Dixon, and given what we're likely to experience in the next few decades about climate change, I think actually more shelter is going to be required. In some places, I think actually roofing might be required in the middle of the city, with the way some laneways have done it in Melbourne. And you know, I like what they've done in Melbourne. Yet I'm a Sydney sider originally, so please, you know, accept that as I'm not a committed Melburnian. I like that. But the other thing I really wanted to ask you about is you mentioned civic and contributing districts, which brings me to Reed. Now, Reed is very much a contributing district, although it's a very small one. And of course, as you know, most of the area is a heritage precinct. What are your plans for that particular part of the centre part of Canberra?
Look, thank you for that question. There are a number of sites of direct interest to us, and we call that part of our precinct the Southeast District. I'll start with probably the most significant renewal project that's going to emerge over the next decade in that part of the city centre, and that's the new UNSW Canberra City campus. Government has asked us to lead the coordination of that development project, and we are already well advanced in our discussions with UNSW and their architects about the first stage of development, which will be on the corner of Constitution and Corranderk. There is a very comprehensive, and I think as an urban designer, very high quality master plan in place to guide that development. The NCA is the Planning Approval Authority. So there are, Marion, I can assure you, lots of checks and balances in place to ensure that we get a very high quality development outcome there. The UNSW campus extends over the CIT Reed campus, which itself backs onto the Heritage Rail Reserve along that part of Reed, and that's a very important corridor, one which has a conservation management plan associated with it, and which the master plan acknowledges needs to be retained but also improved in a landscape sense to make it a really important and used public space. Further to the west, the Glebe Park area, and I mean the area between, again, Corranderk and Alara Street, so the area bounded by Glebe Park, the casino, the Crown Hotel, and the convention centre. That's the sort of the surrounding buildings. We're currently doing due diligence on that area in relation to its future, and we have also identified that Glebe Park itself also potentially needs some thinking about because it's a bit like Hague Park and the work we did there. We recognise that surrounding development around Glebe Park is driving more people to it as a local park, and certainly we think there's scope to try and secure government funding to also improve it. But the main focuses of our work is on UNSW, making sure that it is a very high quality campus, that it is knitted back into, particularly through active travel again, acknowledging that future light rail will be travelling down Constitution Avenue past it, and therefore we could back to the earlier point about reducing car usage, that it can be a campus that's not about cars but is actively promoting active travel modes.
And could I just add, what about light pollution and noise and things like that? How is that going to be managed?
Well, I think, light pollution, across all cities is an issue, but I think technology to some degree has a solution to that. I think many of the luminaires that are now available are conscious about reducing or being designed to reduce that kind of spillage, if I could call it that. They're far more energy efficient. Certainly, we think a comprehensive lighting strategy is needed for the city centre. What we see across the city centre is a combination of different technologies. Modern cities are thinking about those environmental impacts and are designing and providing lighting systems that are not only more cost efficient, but also environmentally friendly.
Thank you. Thanks, Malcolm.
Ian.
Thanks, Malcolm. Thanks, Doug, for your presentation. Very interesting. I think a few of the speakers asking questions prior to me have really highlighted I think the way you'd put it would be a very exciting opportunity between Dixon, Section 72, the tradies, and some of the areas a bit north of that, including Canberra Winery and Thoroughbred Park. One of the things that really worries me, having lived in the area for 20, 30 years, is the increasing loss of community facilities. Just about every type of community facility, whether it be schools, preschools, the population is increasing rapidly, but we don't see any addition to any of the community facilities. Part of my role is to find meeting places for the NCCC when you try and find a meeting place in and around Dixon, Lynham, there's a new one in Hay Park, of course, which looks fantastic, and is a reuse of a previous building. But how are you going to assess the requirements for community infrastructure and green space that will be required in this area? This new development will be, the next shot that describes the area for the next 50 years. It's a great opportunity, an exciting opportunity. I'm just worried that what quite often happens around Dixon and that area is that things are done on the cheap and they look like it. When you look at Woolies, you look at the surrounds now of the library, which Taglietti Square really does, speak about the architecture and just how exciting that whole area can be. But it really does look crappy at the moment when you wander through there. So, I'm excited that you guys have got your hands amongst that area, but how are you going to ensure that there is that quality rather than just developers just pumping more and more real estate into that area, more buildings into that area?
Yes, look, that's a really good question. And certainly we acknowledge that Dixon, because of its growing population and further densification around it within the close catchment of the centre, will mean that those facilities do need to be provided to meet that future demand. We think that there are opportunities within territory-owned land, within the group centre even, which I think should be examined for those opportunities. So I certainly don't think at this stage that it's going to be highest and best use and just take it to market and flog it off. I think that certainly we're very conscious, not only in terms of supporting and strengthening the facilities already in Section 72, but in the group centre itself, there will be opportunities, potentially even with private lessees who are contemplating redevelopment, to think about how we could integrate those facilities within those sites. I mean, this is something which is commonly done in many other cities, that they might be privately owned buildings, but we're seeing schools, we're seeing community centres, all being provided as integral to those private developments. And, developers quite like the idea of a long-term tenant, community tenant, where government is able to fund that. So I think it's an important point, and certainly in relation to green spaces, Section 72, which I think is quite unloved at the moment. I think there are great opportunities to see how those spaces which will remain green spaces, particularly along the Sullivan's Creek drain, and certainly, again, there's a tantalising opportunity there to further naturalise that corridor. But certainly I think within Section 72, those pre-existing green spaces, the trees, the established canopies, the vegetation, all, I think, provide an exciting opportunity to knit that back into the landscape of the group centre itself. It's why our streetscape work is also looking at opportunities for further tree planting and landscaping, as well as lighting and street furniture. So I think we are very conscious of the need to not only lift the quality of the public environment, but to make sure that those public facilities are what the future residents, as well as the existing residents of Dixon and the catchment of the group centre, will need into the future.
Malcolm, a couple of sort of big issue items following on from what Ian was asking about social infrastructure. Two things. We are confronted with a projection that in North Canberra will need to house 100,000 people more than they have now. And the second is housing affordability and ways to make sure that social, supportive, and in the widest sense, public housing is close to facilities and to public transport. And in the moment, what we're seeing is that most valuable places for public housing in that respect are being sold off to investors in the city and around Dixon too. And that will be an issue too in the whole problem of housing another 100,000 people. And so NCCC has been hammering for years that the whole area sort of northwest of the Dixon precinct would need to be considered as a huge opportunity for high density urban development, and not a piecewise attempt for clubs to find a better way of financing their activities.
So you're referring to Thoroughbed Park and
Yes.
the proposals we're
And
seeing.
Iwani, actually.
Yeah. Look, I could fob that off by saying it's not within our precinct, but
No.
I concur with you that good planning would recognise that the investment made in light rail, its location means it is a very strategic site. I mean, the CRA really has had no involvement in the discussions that have been happening within government about that site, Jürgen, but certainly in relation to both Canberra Winery and Iwani, we have certainly tried to encourage both those developers to provide a much better use mix. Any sites that we take to market must incorporate at least a 15% component of affordable and or social housing, not public housing, because the responsibility for the identification of those sites and the integration of those in private sector developments is with ACT Housing. But certainly we as an authority have to be seen to be doing our bit to supporting both affordable, social and potentially public housing opportunities. And that's why we have a number of pilot studies underway at the moment to look at, for example, the conversion, adaptive reuse of old commercial buildings for potentially affordable social and possibly even public housing. So we don't have to be thinking about necessarily building new things. Post-COVID, you've got a lot of old commercial buildings in our precinct where the owners are trying to work out what they're going to do with them. And many cities are now turning to adaptive reuse of those commercial buildings to convert them into affordable, social, and in some cases even public housing. So that's something that we are pursuing. But in any sites that we take to market, and one that we recently took to market in the city centre, all of the developers who submitted proposals complied with, in some cases even exceeded that target that we had specifically written into EOI. So there's, the developers will do it if asked. But certainly I think the government is aware that they need to be doing their bit to encourage and address the wicked problem that I think you're describing.
I mean, in a way, there's a need for a strategic approach to quarantining sites that would be needed for public housing in the widest sense. And that will be a hugely important aspect of urban densification. Because putting them out into the periphery is about the worst thing you can do.
Yes. No, look, as a planner, I would totally agree with you that they need to be close to the facilities, the accessibility that they need to be able to support that type of those types of dwellings and those residents that are using them. So, I mean, I think you're right. There needs to be a strategic view about crown leases and other, public land, albeit, with other arrangements over it. But certainly, I think there needs to be a critical view of all of that. Thoroughbed Park, I must stress, is outside our precinct, but certainly within our precinct.
So how do we get it into your precinct? What do we need to do?
Well, the Chief Minister has been happy to extend it once. He can extend it again if he wants to.
Okay.
So if you thought that was important and you needed an authority such as ours to take, as we are with Acton Waterfront, committed to providing affordable and social housing within that project, you know, so I mean, I would encourage you to think about that, and if you thought that that was an opportunity to approach your elected representatives.
Okay, Ian, thanks.
Thanks, Shocking. I'd be remiss if I didn't raise this point that's come in from the Braddon Collective, Malcolm, which was they are really firm on the idea of the Dixon Pool becoming a whole of year, 12-month, 24-hour-a-day facility, aquatic facility for all the people who live in the catchment of Dixon Pool. And I think it'll be architecturally and from a landscape perspective, a potentially very beautiful site for the community to exist in. Just the other point about how we get that master planning that includes Thoroughbred Park, Yawani, Canberra Winery, which of course was a ACT government gift to promote the wine industry at one stage before the Alvin Group took it over. And here's an example of where potentially the government should really step into some of these sites and say, we'll be the developer of this site. We don't want you to go and pick a developer. We'll be the developer, and we'll have a master plan that really tries to accommodate all of the important tasks faced by government, especially when it comes to affordable. And there's no more affordable housing than public housing, of course. Affordable housing being 75% of market, which is a bit of a misnomer, seeing rents seem to be rising faster than people's income. The other, just finally, the question that I had was, as part of your toolkit, do you have software that enables you to test the heat sink and heat exposure of developments? So if someone decides they're going to build a tall building surrounded by concrete with very little landscape and no renewables, do you have, as part of your approach, to say, well, look, we're facing a climate catastrophe. You guys, we expect you to design your buildings that are not only climate resilient, but carbon positive, and how they fit into the bigger plan of, you know, your canopy and greening. So do you have those techniques?
Well, certainly in our capacity as a referral entity, we look specifically at those aspects. And for example, where we don't see provision for deep root planting and trees, for example, where basements are proposed to go right to the boundary as opposed to setting those basements back to accommodate, for example, significant tree canopy. These are the sorts of things that we identify and comment on. And generally, those sorts of comments, criticisms, if you want to call it that, are picked up by the planners, and the developers do revise their schemes. But certainly one of the principles we look at all of those applications is sustainability, and certainly we get down to the level of looking at solar impacts. We look at specifically the solar access that many of these apartments in fact don't have. And there's a recent one which you would have read about recently on Northbourne Avenue, the JW Land proposal, which I think they're into now version 4 of their scheme. And, you know, these developers just simply don't get it, that, you know, they have an obligation to provide not only, you know, development projects that meet those sustainability targets, but you're also fit for habitation. And, you know, when you get 30% of a development with no winter sunlight, then that's just totally unacceptable. We're going back to the slums of the future, you know. So I think, look, a long answer, but the short answer is that we are as an entity and as an agency, quite prepared to point out some of these aspects. Whether the new territory plan, to return to that theme, gives the planners and the assessing officers the ability to reject it on sustainability grounds is yet to be seen. But certainly we are not backwards in pointing out the deficiencies of those projects around some of those basic sustainability environmental design features.
Just a simple point though, Malcolm. CSIRO did those fantastic heat sinks mapping of the suburbs, and we've shown that no slide on planners here, but that we've managed to develop some of the hottest suburbs in Australia, in especially the north of Canberra. Can we use that technology in a sort of a preventative sense where we see the design? I think we've gone past shadow diagrams, haven't we, that show us how buildings won't get 30%. 30% of the units won't get any sun. We must have technology that can tell us straight up that Dixon's going to be a heat sink if we go this way, or to improve it, we need to do A, B, and C. Surely we have that technology.
Well, we do, and we recently ran in conjunction with, I'm trying to think of the name of the body, Doug might help me, but we actually we called it a robot, but it was actually a thermal imaging device that on wheels, sort of a bit like R2-D2, and we got it to literally travel around the city centre, measuring temperatures in different locations, under trees, in exposed areas, and we're about to receive the report from that work, which was run by a reputable scientific group out of the United States, in fact, and this was the first time this technology had been applied in Australia. So you are right, we have the ability to be able to not only identify existing conditions, but based on that data, then inform our decisions about, for example, increasing tree canopy, the importance of introducing green roofs, particularly for a medium rise to higher rise buildings. These are all things that other cities are doing, I think, far better than Canberra. And certainly I think we as an agency are alert to the fact that we need to, not only through our capital improvements, but be encouraging private developers to be, doing not best practice, but potentially even next practice approaches to good building design. So I agree with your point, but we're doing what we can. Maybe we could agitate a bit more loudly, perhaps.
One last thing, Malcolm. What's your most favourite architecturally? I don't want to put you on the spot here, but I will. Your favourite building on Northbourne Avenue between the city and Southwell Park, Anthill Street, the new ones?
Well, Peter, look, my professional view would be that as a collection of buildings, it's not the Champs-Élysées. I mean, we might have had aspirations for it to be a grand avenue city approach. Unfortunately, and I think I can say it now to you, that the good intentions of that city gateway plan really were too little too late. I think for the remaining sites along Northbourne, we can do a lot better. And that's why, for example, on that JW Land project, they've tried 4 times to get an approval and they've been rejected because it's a lousy development. What I think could save Northbourne Avenue is that we also go back to some of the proposals in that gateway strategy for strengthening the landscape experience as you drive along that corridor, for encouraging a conversion of it from what I would call a subarterial road to a proper street, which does accommodate other modes. Light rail is a good start, but certainly I think there's an opportunity to look critically at the way, the way Northbourne currently operates. I'm not suggesting 40K all the way along, but it would start, for example, with a simple, if I could call it, guerrilla tactic, that out of the AM and PM peaks, you allow curbside parking. Start to introduce some friction into the system. And that's the way it starts in many other cities. I look at post-COVID Sydney, and many of those, that asphalt that was taken back to provide opportunities for improved cycling for people to actually get around their local neighbourhoods. And after the pandemic, post-pandemic, the decision's been made by many of those inner city councils in Sydney to not reopen those roads, to actually create green space. And, the City of Melbourne has converted in the city centre 90 hectares of asphalt into public space. Now, if the City of Melbourne can do that within their very different conditions and even more challenging conditions, then why can't we in Canberra set ourselves the same kind of target? And, I'm all for asphalt conversion because the cars will find an alternative way of getting around. And I thought that's why we invested in Madura Avenue anyway, to have a proper orbital system. But look, these are all things that we as an authority can have a view about. Our degree of influence, we're only a small agency, but I think good ideas, well argued. There is a place for our agency to be doing that, Ian, and we won't be backwards in coming forward on those sorts of questions.
Thank you.
Thanks. Doug, you have your hands up.
Yes, thank you so much. I was just hoping to speak briefly before we wrap up. I wanted to quickly introduce myself. I lead content engagement as part of Malcolm's team. I wanted to thank Jochen and Ian in particular for arranging to have us on tonight. It did originate from the Section 72 announcement because we sent a heads up to the council, but wanted to reiterate, we are very happy to drop into this group and speak about our projects for as short or as long as you'd like. Whenever you like, please just reach out to me and I'll make that happen. We also speak to the Dixon Residents Group and the Braddon Collective 3 to 4 times each per year. Peter Callan knows that. Thanks for your supportive comment a moment ago, Peter. I look forward to your continued constructive critique. And tomorrow we'll send the slides as PDFs, and I'll also send some links to a few open public consultations we have. There's the Dixon Shops revitalisation. So these are proposed designs for improvements to the Dixon Shops area that Malcolm mentioned briefly. There's also the Canberra Civic and Cultural District, which is the area surrounding the Canberra Theatre redevelopment and Civic Square. And of course, there's the City Hill Ideas exhibition. But finally, the last plug is for an event this Sunday at midday at the corner, well, the intersection of Mort and Allura Streets in Braddon. We are closing the road, topical, based on your last topic, and it's to promote sustainable travel. It's a street party. It'll be a great time and lots of things to do, particularly for the family. Thanks again for having us.
Thanks heaps, Doug.
Thank you.
And thanks, Malcolm, for your time. I understand you're retiring.
I don't like that word, Joachim. It's moving to another phase, part-time work. But I think I'd go mad if I still wasn't thinking and trying to make good cities. So still committed to that.
Okay, thanks.
All right. Anytime. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your time.